When we talk about the historicity of the resurrection, a lot of times you'll hear defenses of the resurrection, and they'll mention things like, well, there were Roman soldiers there, and how could they have let Jesus just, the disciples steal the body or something like that. But in fact, the vast majority of critical scholars would reject much of the biblical account of the resurrection narrative, the burial and resurrection narrative. So what I do in the book is I say, okay, what can be proven beyond reasonable doubt? What points related to the resurrection? I think we can build a very strong case for the resurrection from the ground up, from these points that are practically indisputable. And so let me give you just 5 points that are practically indisputable with reference to the resurrection. The first one is that Jesus died by crucifixion in about AD 30 to 33. I think that is a fact of history. Some people say Jesus never existed. Those are the lunatic fringe. No historian really believes Jesus never existed. The most indisputable fact about the life of Jesus was that he was crucified. We could even say crucified by the Romans, since the Romans crucified, under Pontius Pilate in Palestine in about AD 33. No one denies that. No one also denies, I don't think, credible scholars anyway, that Jesus actually died on the cross. The Romans were very good at what they did, and the idea that Jesus may not have died on the cross and was resuscitated in the tomb, to me is just incredibly ludicrous. It takes an enormous leap of faith that Jesus would roll the stone away, crawl out, and suddenly proclaim to his disciples that he had risen, and they would say, yes, he's risen. They'd more likely say, ooh, he survived, but it's awful. They would not be proclaiming the resurrection. So Jesus died by crucifixion. The second indisputable fact is that Jesus was buried, that he was buried in a tomb. John Dominic Crossan and some others say, well, crucifixion victims were often just left exposed, eaten by dogs, eaten by birds, thrown on a common criminal burial pile. But there's such a strong tradition in all 4 Gospels that not only was Jesus buried, but he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. We have the name of the person who owned the tomb. There's no symbolic significance to Joseph, to his name. It's clear that this is the figure, an individual, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high council. There's no way the church would invent a character who was part of the enemy, basically. And so there's no doubt in my mind, it seems to me indisputable, that Joseph of Arimathea was a historical figure, that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. So Jesus died on the cross. Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. The third indisputable fact was that the tomb was shortly after, 3 days, discovered to be empty. Now, there's lots of strong evidence for that. One of the strongest pieces of evidence is all 4 Gospels say that it was women who discovered the empty tomb. And we know that in the first century, women were not viewed as credible witnesses. They were not allowed to testify in court. So if the church invented these empty tomb stories, they would not have made women the people who discovered the empty tomb. That proves to me beyond reasonable doubt that the tomb was empty. Of course, if the tomb was not empty, then Jesus' enemies, since the gospel was proclaimed first in Jerusalem, I think everyone agrees it was proclaimed in Jerusalem, the enemies would have just shown the tomb. They would have been able to gone and get the body of Jesus to demonstrate this. So it seems to me beyond doubt that Jesus died on the cross, that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, that 3 days later the tomb was discovered empty. The fourth practically indisputable piece of evidence are the resurrection appearances. There seems to be absolutely no doubt that the disciples saw Jesus alive, or at least claimed to have seen Jesus alive. Take, for example, the Apostle Paul, who mentions the resurrection appearances. He appeared to Peter, he appeared to the 12. Then Paul says he appeared to more than 500 people. Now, Paul is a primary source account. Paul was alive when many of these people were still alive and talked to them. So you can say whether or not they saw Jesus, you can say they had hallucinations, whatever, you can say whatever you want. But there's no doubt that Paul knew that at least 500 people claimed to have seen Jesus alive. That's pretty good evidence that of the resurrection appearances. The other one that's really significant in that regard is the resurrection appearance to Peter. The resurrection appearance to Peter is presented in 2 different sources, distinct sources, but it's never narrated. It's never described as the appearance. Instead, Paul reports that Peter saw Jesus alive, and then when the disciples on the road to Emmaus, returning from Emmaus, the apostles are declaring that Peter saw Jesus alive. Then Jesus appears to them. So the episode to Peter, we get in two independent accounts. It's pretty strong evidence that Peter claimed to have seen Jesus alive. So number 4, indisputable fact. The disciples claim to have seen Jesus alive. David Friedrich Strauss, one of the most vehement critics of the historicity of the gospel, once said that one thing that's absolutely certain is the disciples claim to have seen Jesus alive. He didn't believe Jesus had risen from the dead, but the disciples claim. So indisputable. So what do we have? Jesus was dead. Jesus was crucified by the Romans and killed. Secondly, Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Third, the tomb was empty shortly after that. And fourth, the disciples claimed to have seen Jesus alive. The fifth and final is, of course, the transformed lives of the disciples. It's pretty obvious from the gospel accounts that the disciples did not expect Jesus to rise from the dead. From their Jewish perspective, the resurrection was something that took place at the end of time, not within time. So they were not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead. Something happened on that Easter morning that completely transformed them from cowards who ran and who just disappeared at the first sign of trouble, who rejected Jesus, as Peter himself did, into transform them from these cowering disciples to bold apostles proclaiming the gospel, willing to suffer and die. Were they willing to suffer and die for a lie? Were they willing to suffer and die for something they really didn't believe? It seems highly unlikely. Again, a clear confirmation that they, in fact, did see Jesus alive, their transformed lives. So let's review briefly. Christ truly died on the cross. No one doubts that. Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. The tomb was empty 3 days later. The disciples claim, multiple disciples, 500, claim that Jesus was alive, and those claims absolutely transformed their life. That's pretty good evidence, pretty good circumstantial, pretty good indisputable, it seems to me, evidence that Jesus, in fact, rose from the dead.